The sun rose heavy over Mississippi that year, as if tired of shining over the same fields for too many centuries. By 1903, the war that once promised transformation had long been reduced to memory, a myth masquerading as victory. Freedom had come written on paper but never planted in the soil. The South moved forward only in name. Its people, those once enslaved and now free, carried the weight of broken promises like invisible chains. And somewhere in that in-between world, between slavery and whatever came after, lived Sarah Mills. A hush followed her name wherever it was spoken. She lived on the outskirts of Jasper County, near a hollow field where weeds had devoured what was once a grand plantation. The land was silent now, except for the evening cicadas and the hiss of wind through cracked shutters. Her cabin, no larger than a single room, leaned beneath the branch of an old pecan tree. An iron kettle hung outside, and near it stood a grave with no marker, only a rough wooden cross. That was where her mother, Lydia, had been buried. No date, no inscription, no certainty except that she rested. Sarah would be nearing 40 now, though no one could bring themselves to believe it. Her face, smooth, unlined, and still carrying the light of 19, refused to tell the same story her birth year did. Her skin glowed like oiled mahogany in the afternoon sun. Her eyes, rich and dark, seemed older than time yet untouched by it. To some, she was a marvel. To most, she was a threat. Every town holds its secrets, but Jasper's breathed. Whispers swelled in church pews and on front porches. The girl who doesn't age. The woman the devil forgot to claim. The curse that walks at sunset. None dared speak it to her face. The South had grown skillful at quiet cruelty. Sarah never argued, never defended her existence. She worked the same cotton rows her mother once did, her hands rough but steady, her movements fluid from decades of repetition. Each morning before dawn, she wrapped her hair in linen, stepped into dew-wet soil, and picked the first blooms before the sun rose too high. Her body remained 19, but her shoulders carried every year she'd lived. The ache in her hands was proof enough of age, even if her reflection wasn't. The days unfurled quietly. No clock, no company. The only sound inside her cabin came from the worn pages of an old Bible, one her mother had passed down before dying. Most of its words had faded beneath time and sweat, but one verse clung stubbornly to its page. For there is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed. Sarah would read it out loud every night. To her, those words weren't divine promise. They were a warning. Sometimes, she could still smell the tobacco on her mother's dress, hear the low hum of her mother's voice singing to the rhythm of wooden wheels grinding in the distance. Memories had a way of aging even when she couldn't. Faces blurred, voices softened. The world kept moving forward, drifting further away from her. It was the cruelest part of not aging, watching every other living thing surrender to time while she remained behind, anchored by something neither natural nor holy. The white families in town found other ways to rationalize her strangeness. Doctors from Jackson and Mobile had come years earlier to study her. They pressed her skin, measured her breath, speculated about curses and genetics. They drew her blood and labeled her anatomical mystery, but science walked away empty-handed. There was no explanation in their journals. Only a note that read, "The subject appears to defy chronological progression." When Sarah refused further examinations, the same men who once called her study material began calling her trouble. Truth was of little use in Mississippi. Yet through all that fear and ignorance, Sarah never once sought to flee. This land was both her prison and her inheritance. Her mother had been born here, enslaved here, buried here. Leaving it would feel like abandoning the only witness left to her story. Every evening, Sarah would walk barefoot to the edge of the field as dusk painted the sky in purple and brass. The air would thicken with the sweet, smoky scent of cotton fires from neighboring farms. She'd pause there, arms folded, eyes on the horizon, a woman standing between centuries, carrying both the burden of remembrance and the price of survival. She never prayed for youth. She prayed only for rest. But rest never came. Time wasn't her companion. It was her shadow, silent, endless, and unmerciful. By nightfall, the sound of crickets would rise around her cabin. She would sit by the doorway, oil lamp flickering against her face, knowing that somewhere across the broken fields, people spoke her name like a superstition. They feared that approaching her might invite the same fate, a life too long, a body too still, a story too strange to end. But the truth of Sarah Mills wasn't strange. It was sorrow wearing the mask of a miracle. And as the moon lifted over the hollow land, a cold whisper seemed to travel through the fields, the echo of her mother's last words, the ones she never forgot. "Don't let them take your name." Sarah closed her eyes and whispered back into the dark, "They took everything else." If the story of this woman grips your heart, stay with it, because the next truth buried in her name is one America never wanted revealed. Days turned into seasons, and Jasper slept through history. The world beyond Mississippi had begun to awaken, telegraph wires crawling across the nation, trains carrying men westward, factories rising like iron prayers. But in Jasper, time folded in on itself, and that meant Sarah Mills still stood at the center of a circle that refused to widen. For some, she was a curiosity. For others, a threat too easily explained by old fears. A young preacher once told his congregation that the devil made her eternal to taunt the faithful. His sermon was received with nods, but when Sarah later walked past his home, he lowered his gaze. Fear, in Jasper, often looked like respect from a distance. Sarah had long accepted her solitude. She tilled the soil, traded her cotton for bread and salt, and spoke only when spoken to. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her reflection had not changed in 20 years. But her soul had, rippling with something she never spoke aloud, the exhaustion of permanence. When the nights grew too silent, she would remember the war stories her mother told. Lydia had said that freedom would come like summer rain, sudden, washing the dirt clean. It had come instead like slow frost, creeping and cold, killing from beneath. "Freedom," her mother once whispered, "ain't freedom if you still work the same field." Sarah had been too young to understand then. Now she understood too well. In early spring, a stranger arrived on horseback. The locals called him Dr. Edmund Calder, a scientist from the north chasing the whispers of an unaging woman. He carried a leather case filled with instruments, polished metal, clean linen, notebooks so white they seemed out of place in this land of dust and sweat. Calder's curiosity was not cruel. It was desperate. The world had begun to believe it could conquer nature, and Sarah's existence threatened that belief. When he first saw her, he was struck not by her youth but by her silence. She stood at the field's edge, sunlight drawing gold through her hair. Her presence was unhurried, as though she had already lived through whatever he was about to say. He spoke with confidence, asking questions, age, origins, habits, but she gave him few words. "People been asking them same things since I was a girl," she said finally, without looking up. "Ain't found an answer yet." Calder smiled, though uneasily. Her tone carried no defiance, only truth so heavy it made the air taut. Still, he returned the next day, and the next, jotting observations. Pulse steady, skin smooth, no signs of age. He asked for a small vial of blood. She allowed it without protest. When he watched the crimson swirl beneath his lens, he whispered what his scientific mind refused to frame: "Impossible." He stayed in Jasper for weeks, living out of the church guest house. The townsfolk grew suspicious. To them, every northerner was either a thief or a fool, and Calder seemed both for chasing something they considered cursed. Rumors crept through doorways. "He's making pacts with her. He's trying to sell her to medicine. He's playing with what God meant to stay buried." Fear breeds stories, and Jasper had learned to feed on them. Sarah bore it all silently. When a rock shattered the window of her cabin one night, She swept up the glass and sat back down to finish mending her dress. Her hands did not tremble. She had outlasted worse storms than this one. Calder found her by the river the next morning. She sat near the water, the hem of her dress soaking in the shallows, eyes fixed on the reflection that never changed. He tried, clumsily, to comfort her, told her that the world might learn from her, that maybe her body held the secret to life itself. For the first time, she looked at him. Her voice was low, calm, almost kind. "It's a curse, not a lesson." He had no answer for that. Science rarely does when faced with sorrow. By the next week, word of Calder's findings began to spread. Letters arrived from New Orleans, Mobile, even New York, men offering money, positions, travel. But their words reduced her to specimen, never person. Sarah refused to leave. When Calder begged her to consider, she replied with slow finality, "My mother in that ground. I don't belong to them." He left weeks later, defeated but changed. His final note read, "I came to study immortality. I left humbled by endurance." He never published his findings. Instead, he sent his notes north, where they vanished into archives no one cared to preserve. Sarah, as before, remained. Life returned to its rhythm of cotton, hunger, and rumor. Except now she was no longer invisible. The town that once ignored her now watched. Her every step, her silence, her youth, all were invitations to imagine evil where none existed. Children threw pebbles, women crossed the road, men avoided her eyes. Sometimes, at night, she'd think of Calder's words, life as a lesson, and wonder if perhaps he was half right. Maybe her body wasn't proof of eternity but punishment for remembering too much. Because in her dreams, faces still came to her. Her mother's, the men in chains, the babies buried too soon. Each glance from the past whispered the same unbearable truth. You outlived them all. There is no miracle lonelier than survival. If this story stays with you, listen closely, because the next turn in Sarah's life reveals what happens when science, faith, and fear all meet the same woman. Autumn returned to Jasper like a veil of dust, slow, heavy, and reluctant to leave. The air thickened with the scent of burned cane and wet soil after rain. It was the season of harvest, yet the land seemed tired, its tiredness mirrored in the faces of those who worked it. Except for Sarah's. Year after year, she stood in the fields with the same posture, the same rhythm, the same steady hands that cut and gathered, cut and gathered. To the other workers, she was a constant reminder of what time could take and what it chose to leave untouched. They tried to avoid her eyes, for in her gaze some saw envy, others saw fear. And though no one spoke it aloud, all sensed that being near her meant touching something the world had not meant to understand. She no longer prayed for explanation. Her faith, though unbroken, had grown quiet, a pulse beneath skin, not a voice in the air. Sundays found her sitting on the edge of church steps, listening from outside as hymns drifted through open windows. Amazing Grace carried through the air like smoke. Its irony didn't escape her. Inside, the same people who feared her asked God for mercy. And outside, mercy sat alone. In the fall of 1903, Sarah's photograph reached New York. Somewhere between gossip and fascination, a traveling journalist published it under the headline, "The Woman Time Forgot." The picture, monochrome, soft at the edges, showed Sarah staring directly into the camera, expressionless, timeless. The light caught her eyes in such a way that they seemed to hold the reflection of a life half-lived. It took only weeks for that photograph to circle the nation. Preachers used her name as proof of divine mystery. Scientists scribbled theories of cellular restraint and stunted metabolic decay. And racists twisted it into another lie, claiming her stillness was punishment for her bloodline. Within months, strangers began to arrive in Jasper, stepping off trains with notebooks, sketches, and pity disguised as kindness. They wanted to see her, as if her body itself were an exhibit. Some even offered money for a touch of her hand. Sarah refused them all. She stayed to her land like tree roots to clay. But no boundary can keep curiosity out forever. By December, curiosity turned violent. A group of locals, men too poor to own their own fields, stormed her cabin one night after sunset. They came drunk, with the bravery of ignorance. They called her witch, fraud, devil's bride. They demanded she explain herself. She stood calm in the doorway, oil lamp in hand, the flame flickering but steady. She did not speak. Her silence unnerved them more than any witchcraft ever could. One of the men struck the lamp from her grip. The flame spilled, licking across the wooden wall before she smothered it beneath her shawl. For a brief moment, her face glowed in firelight, serene, motionless, eternal. The sight quieted them. They left in haste, afraid of what they had not seen but felt, that she was untouchable. When dawn came, Sarah packed what little she owned, her Bible, a comb, Lydia's scarf, and walked away from the ashes of her home. She didn't look back. She moved toward the river, toward the voice of something older than hatred or science. It was the same river where once years ago, her mother had whispered lullabies to the rhythm of washing clothes against stone. The past, like the river, had a way of circling back. There she built a new shack from driftwood and metal scraps. Day after day she carried water, mended nets, and bartered fish for bread in town. Life simplified itself, and still she remained untouched. The newspaper stopped printing her name, the travelers stopped visiting, but Jasper never forgot. In every rumor told by lamplight, her name resurfaced like oil above water. Sometimes at dusk, children from the village would dare each other to follow her to the river. They hid behind the reeds, whispering that her reflection didn't cast ripples. Most nights, she ignored them. But one evening, she turned, her expression neither stern nor kind. Her gaze met theirs, and in that instant, they saw not mystery, but sorrow. They ran home crying, unsure why the sadness in her eyes struck them harder than any curse could have. For Sarah, existence had become its own punishment. Loneliness was not emptiness. It was the loud echo of all the voices she had outlived. At night, she carved names into her wooden table, those she remembered, her mother, her brother James who died at 9, her cousin Ruth who had married and passed in childbirth, the overseer's name she could never forget but would never say. The table looked like a ledger of ghosts by the time she was done. Young forever, they called her. But inside, every scar, every death, every betrayal had aged her in places no one could see. Her heart carried decades, while her body carried none. Once, while the wind howled over the river, she whispered into the darkness, not to God, not to herself, but to the emptiness that had grown beside her. How long is forever, if it forgets what it's saving? The river answered in silence. It always did. If this story moves you, stay close, because in Sarah's quiet struggle, we meet the reflection of a nation that never learned to grow old with its own truth. Winter settled over Mississippi that year like a second skin, thin at first, then suffocating. The fields turned brittle, the air carried the smell of frozen rain, and the river thickened with fog so dense it seemed to swallow noise itself. Sarah lived within that silence, moving as though she had become part of it. Her cabin by the river was a patchwork of wood and rusted tin, precarious against the wind. Inside, her world was reduced to the essentials: a chair, a small stove, her mother's Bible, and the carved table of names. The river's rhythm had replaced the ticking of clocks. To anyone else, this life would seem desolate. To Sarah, it was peace, the only kind she could still afford. The townsfolk rarely saw her now, but her presence lingered in rumor. They spoke of her as myth, the girl who never aged, living off river fish and solitude. Parents warned their children not to wander too close. Men joked nervously about the woman whose soul the devil forgot to claim. Yet under all their words lay something purer than fear: fascination. The kind that drives people to build legends from what they can't understand. On a morning draped in fog, a man arrived at the edge of the riverbank. His name was Jonas Heller, a traveling photographer who had once taken Sarah's picture 6 months earlier, the portrait that made her infamous. He had returned not for money, but for something else entirely: remorse. Fame had found him on the back of her suffering, and guilt had not left him since. He found her sitting near the water, barefoot despite the cold. Her dress was patched, her hair streaked with the faintest gray, the only sign that maybe, just maybe, time had begun to remember her. She didn't move when he approached. Only her eyes turned, calm as the current. "I came to make it right," he said softly. "The picture, I shouldn't have." She cut him off with a glance, not angry, but tired beyond expression. "What's done is done," she murmured. Her voice carried the weight of a century. Jonas offered her a small envelope, trembling in his gloved hand. Inside were 2 photographs, one of her face as the world had seen it, flawless, mysterious, and another, taken quietly the day she walked away from her burning cabin. In it, her face was half shadow, half light, human. "You can burn them if you like," he said, "or keep them. I just thought you should own what's yours." She studied the images but said nothing. Then, carefully, she tore the glossy paper in half and let the pieces drift into the current. For a moment, the river carried her likeness, and then it was gone, consumed by the endless gray water. Jonas didn't ask her to pose again. He watched her stand and walk up the hill toward her cabin, every step deliberate, unhurried, as if even gravity respected her pace. When she disappeared into the fog, he realized that perhaps what made her extraordinary was not her unchanging body, but her refusal to let the world define its meaning for her. It would be the last time anyone photographed Sarah Mills. Winter thinned into spring. The new year came without announcement. No bells, no papers, no proof that the world beyond Jasper even noticed time passing. But Sarah did. She noticed how the grass returned a little slower, how the river smelled of silt instead of sweetness. And for the first time in memory, her reflection seemed different. Not aged, not decayed, just gentler. The muscles in her face relaxed where tension had always lived. Her eyes softened, less like mirrors, more like windows. Perhaps she was finally changing after all. She began to write letters she never mailed. Not confessions, not pleas, just fragments of thought, written neatly in pencil on torn pages. "I have lived through too many goodbyes. They think not aging is a gift. It is a wound that never closes. If my body stays the same, maybe my soul can still keep moving." Some nights, she lit the stove and read those notes aloud, her voice the only sound in the black stillness. In those moments, even she could imagine the world listening. And when the river wind grew strong, she would lift her face toward it and shut her eyes, whispering, "If forever means anything, let it mean peace." Some said they saw her walking through the fields under moonlight, shawl fluttering, face glowing pale among the stalks, neither ghost nor human, just something beyond the reach of understanding. Others claimed she had simply vanished one night, leaving behind only the faint smell of cedar smoke and an open Bible on her table. No one ever proved either story true. But those few who still remembered her spoke one truth each time her name returned to conversation. That before she disappeared, her eyes no longer looked 19. They looked tired, at last. If her story feels larger than any legend, keep listening, because what follows reveals how one woman's silence forced a broken nation to see itself. By the summer of 1904, Jasper had nearly forgotten Sarah Mills, or at least it pretended to. People do that with ghosts still living among them. It makes the fear easier to swallow. The fields bloomed again, railroads hissed in the distance, and the talk of the town shifted from curses to cotton prices. Yet somewhere beyond the last row of cypress trees, by a slow and silent bend of the river, Sarah still breathed. Her cabin stood half-hidden in tall grass. Vines crept along its edges, blurring the lines between the human and the wild. Inside, Dust hung in the sunlight like a constellation caught in midair. If not for the footprint by the door, one might think the place abandoned. Sarah rose with the dawn each day, her body obedient, her spirit heavy. She no longer went into town. The world outside had proven itself unworthy of her trust. The market women still whispered her name, and their sons, now grown, told stories of the River Witch as if she were a lesson for those who disobeyed. She had become both folklore and warning, not for what she'd done, but for what she failed to do: grow old. The seasons circled endlessly. She felt their touch but saw no proof on her skin. The heat burned darker on her arms, then faded without trace. Her body stayed unchanged, but her soul carried miles. Memory sharpened its teeth, and in the solitude, it began to bite. At night she would lay still, eyes open, counting the cracks on the ceiling. Time, once her greatest adversary, had become her only companion. She would whisper to the emptiness, "Show me something new." The darkness never replied. One afternoon, as thunder gathered in the west, Sarah waded into the river. The sky was dull silver, and the wind thickened like smoke. Each ripple against her legs sent a tremor through the water, a reminder that even stillness, under the right storm, learns to move. She looked down at her reflection, the same gaze, the same face, and felt a sudden ache that had nothing to do with the body. Tears came without sound. She hadn't cried since Lydia's death 4 decades earlier, but now her control fractured. It wasn't grief alone, it was exhaustion, the kind that curls deep into the bones and makes every breath feel borrowed. "If the Lord means me to live," she whispered, "He best mean me to forgive. Forgive the years that forgot her. Forgive the faces that feared her. Forgive the strange mercy that kept her breathing when so many better hearts had gone silent." Lightning cracked above the river, slicing open the sky. The air smelled of metal and rain. The ground shook, not with divine punishment, but with the arrival of something inevitable. That night, the storm stayed until dawn, pounding her small home like a drum. In the morning, her cabin still stood, though half-flooded, mud swallowing the edges of her door. She smiled faintly at the ruin. It was, at last, proof that time still cared enough to touch her world, even if not her body. When the sun rose through the mist, she began to rebuild. Not for survival, but for ceremony, as though putting something broken back together might heal her unseen fractures too. Her hands moved with purpose, crafting, mending, refusing to surrender. In every swing of the hammer, in every plank fixed, she heard her mother's voice. "Don't let them take your name." Her name, yes, the one the newspapers twisted, the one the doctors studied, the one the children mocked. She would reclaim it, not by defending it, but by outlasting every cruel version of it. Weeks passed. Jonah Heller's photograph resurfaced again in distant papers. The story had been edited, misused, retold, a miracle of the South. A proof of curse and faith. 10 years unaged. They turned her into a figment once more. But Sarah, alone by the river, only smiled. People had always preferred legends to truth. Legends asked for wonder. Truth asked for responsibility. And so she kept living, quietly, deliberately, not defying time this time, but existing beside it. As summer turned to gold, children again dared each other to go near her shack. When they peeked through the reeds, they saw her kneeling in front of her cabin, not working, not praying, simply still. They watched, wide-eyed, until one of them whispered, "She's talkin' to the river." They fled before the echo came back. They didn't hear what she had said. She had whispered, "Take the rest of me if you want. Just leave my peace behind." The river moved the way only rivers can move, slow, inevitable, eternal. And for a moment, Sarah could have sworn it answered. If you've stayed this far, stay with her a little longer, because the world that forgot Sarah Mills is about to learn something it's never been ready to hear. Time passed quietly after the great storm, though Sarah no longer marked its passage by days or months. Seasons were enough. The field bloomed, withered, and bloomed again, and she remained, unchanged, a silent witness to the turning of the world. Jasper itself was shifting. Electricity crept into homes, bringing with it the soft hum of modernity. A telegraph office replaced the old sheriff's station. Men in bowler hats began to roam dirt roads preaching opportunity, and women stitched hope into dresses sewn from catalog pages. But not much of it reached the banks of Sarah's river. Her world was the same, and sameness was all she had ever known. The townspeople's curiosity returned with whispers. The youngest generation, raised on legends, began to question them. One of these skeptics was Samuel Green, a boy of 19 who worked at the general store. He had grown up hearing about the woman who stopped time, and decided there was no curse at all, only a secret yet untold. Science was the new faith of men his age. So one morning in late August, he followed the narrow path leading to Sarah's cabin, carrying a small silver pocket watch and the arrogance of youth. As he approached, he found her tending to thin rows of sweet potatoes near the river. Her hair was tied back, her hands earth-stained, her back straight. Nothing in sight looked supernatural, only human. He greeted her with forced confidence. "Ma'am, forgive the intrusion. I came for a truth." She didn't turn. "Then you came to the wrong place," she said. He stepped closer, explaining he wasn't there for stories but understanding. "They say you're proof of something," he murmured. "I believe everything has reason. Maybe time skipped you by mistake." Sarah paused her work, eyes fixed on the horizon. The air trembled slightly, not from wind but memory. "You think time makes mistakes?" she asked. He hesitated, unsure if it was a question or lesson. Finally, she faced him. Her eyes were soft but unflinching. "It don't skip. It don't stop. It just chooses where to land." Samuel lowered his watch, suddenly aware of how loud it ticked in his palm. He wanted to ask more, why her, how long, what it felt like, but words began to taste wrong in his mouth. Before leaving, he offered her the watch. "For company," he said sheepishly. She looked at the small device before closing his hand back around it. "You keep it," she replied. "Sounds like you need time more than I do." He left quietly, but the encounter spread again through Jasper like wildfire. The forever girl had spoken. By the week's end, a preacher from neighboring Greenville arrived, claiming he could restore her to God's timeline. He approached her home shouting scripture, accusing her of harboring Satan's power. Sarah stayed inside, listening as he prayed aloud for her salvation. When his words turned to threats, she opened the door only enough to speak through it. "Preacher, if I was the devil, I'd have left this town long ago." He never returned. Each confrontation left her more alone, but it was a loneliness she no longer resisted. The world could label her however it pleased, saint, sinner, miracle. None of it mattered to the river, and she was starting to see herself as part of its current. Days bled together. Sometimes she would stand at the water's edge and lean forward, watching her reflection ripple, as if waiting for it to betray her. It never did. But one night, something changed. The moon hung high and full, casting silver through the window of her cabin. Sarah awoke from a shallow dream, the kind that feels more like memory than rest, and noticed something unusual. On the table before her sat a bowl of still water. It mirrored her face perfectly, yet when she leaned closer, her reflection didn't follow. The image of herself stayed staring straight back even as she turned away. Her breath caught. It lasted only seconds, the reflection blinking a fraction out of rhythm with her, and then it was gone. The surface stilled. Silence filled the room again. She sat back, heart pounding, uncertain if it had been a trick of light or of the mind. Perhaps exhaustion. Perhaps, finally, time had come to collect its due. The next morning, She walked into town for the first time in years. No one recognized her at first. The new generation saw only a thin woman in a faded dress, older than rumored, but somehow the same. A few older faces recognized her and fell silent. People stared as she passed the bakery, the old courthouse, the twisted oak where men once gathered for reasons best forgotten. She stopped briefly at the general store, bought a spool of thread, and returned home. Nothing more. But her presence left the town unsettled, a reminder that their oldest story was not buried after all. That night she wrote a single line in her Bible's margin. "I have lived longer than truth, but not long enough for peace." If you're still here with her, don't step away, because the next chapter of this life will question what aging, freedom, and legacy truly mean. Spring, 1905. The world beyond Jasper roared with invention. Airplanes were being dreamed of, factories bled smoke into northern skies, and new laws promised equality that few dared believe. But by the river, time stood still, locked in the same rhythm it had always known. And within that stillness, Sarah Mills kept her quiet vigil between worlds, one living, one remembered. The morning air was thick with fog when Sarah woke to strange sounds outside her cabin. Horses, boots, and men's voices. Through the window she saw 3 riders carrying crates stamped with the seal of a northern university. They approached not with reverence, but with entitlement. Men of science again. Their leader, Professor Olcott, spoke politely but firmly. He explained they were collecting biological studies for a research paper on aging. He'd read about her, the girl who defied years, and wanted one small contribution in the service of understanding mankind. Sarah stood in her doorway barefoot, her hands resting against the frame. She didn't answer right away. The wind pressed through the reeds, carrying the faint sound of running water. Finally, she said, "You already understood mankind. You just don't like what you found." The professor tried to reason with her, but Sarah's eyes made argument futile. She stepped forward just once, closing the gap between them until he had to tilt his gaze down to meet hers. She looked no older than his youngest student, yet her presence made him feel ancient. "Go back north," she said quietly, "and study your own reflection first." They left after a few uneasy exchanges, their arrogance leaking into embarrassment. By dusk the sound of horses faded back into silence. Sarah watched them disappear over the ridge, then turned toward her small garden, where new sprouts had begun to push through the wet soil. For a moment she smiled. Not for them, not even for herself, but for proof that something could still be born in a place so haunted by death. But night has a way of testing every fragile piece. That same evening, fires reappeared in distant fields, flames crawling like orange snakes across dry brush. Rumor became accusation. People whispered that it was her doing, that the unaging woman had cursed the harvest again. Anger spread faster than the fire itself. By midnight, a group of townsmen gathered near the riverbank, carrying lanterns and fear disguised as righteousness. They marched to her cabin, shouting words heavy with ignorance. "Burn the spell! Cleanse the land!" They didn't see a woman. They saw a myth they could finally destroy. Sarah didn't run. She stood at her doorway as the mob approached, her posture tall, her voice steady. "You already burned this house once," she said. "What's left to take?" Her calmness unnerved them. No torch touched her cabin that night. Instead, they threw the lanterns into the water, watching them float like dying stars down the river. One by one they left, their courage dissolving into shame. Even mob justice has trouble harming what it can't comprehend. When silence returned, Sarah knelt by the water's edge, where the lanterns flickered in the dark, drifting away. The flames had not touched her, but she felt their heat in memory. She reached into the mud, pulled free a handful of ash from the burned brush, and let it slide through her fingers. "Everything turns to dust," she whispered. Then, more softly, "Even names." The next day, she carried a small wooden box to the grave beneath the pecan tree, her mother's resting place. Inside the box were her letters, her mother's scarf, and a scrap of newspaper bearing her own portrait. She buried it all quietly, pressing the soil firm, sealing the ghosts beneath. The wind moved gently through the branches overhead, carrying the scent of spring earth and rain. From that day forward, she stopped answering to Sarah Mills. When strangers passed and called her name, she only looked toward the water, as if waiting for the river to speak. The town began calling her simply the woman by the river, and for the first time, she didn't mind. Perhaps forgetting was a form of freedom too. Months passed. The fields recovered from the fires, the town from its shame. The photograph disappeared from circulation, replaced by new scandals, new heroes, new myths. Life resumed its endless, hungry rhythm. But the river kept its secrets, and in its reflection shimmered the faint echo of a face that refused to fade. That summer, a child wandering near the water claimed to have seen her sitting beneath the pecan tree at dusk. The boy said she was humming softly, touching the soil as though it were alive, her fingers glinting wet like polished bronze. His mother dismissed it as fancy, just heat and imagination. Yet each season afterward, flowers bloomed at that very spot, even during drought. When asked how it was possible, the townsfolk simply said, "The river remembers." If her story still echoes with you, listen closely, because what remains of Sarah's world will reveal the truth she could never speak aloud. By 1910, the world beyond Jasper had changed in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Electric lights glowed in city streets, voices traveled through telephone wires, and new names rose to national praise. But none of this progress reached the river valley. Here, stagnant air clung to history, and the soil remembered everything it ever swallowed. Sarah still lived by that soil. The river remained her witness. Her body looked no older, her silence no softer. What had once been legend was now myth, and what was myth had turned into the quiet truth that history ignores. She had not spoken to another soul in years. The traders who sometimes passed by saw smoke curling from her chimney but kept their distance, muttering prayers under their breath. Only one person, a schoolteacher named Miss Clara Dorsey, dared to visit her, driven not by curiosity but by reverence. Clara had grown up hearing the stories, yet unlike others, she came not to question, but to listen. On a humid late June morning, Clara found Sarah sitting beside the pecan tree, needle in hand, mending an old shawl. The teacher introduced herself politely, promising no harm, offering a small jar of honey as a gift. Sarah studied her for a long moment before nodding. The two women sat beneath the shade, saying little. Words weren't needed at first. The quiet was enough to bridge the century between them. When Clara finally spoke, she said, "They told us you were the woman who doesn't age. I think you're the woman who remembers." Sarah's eyes lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise softening her face. "Remembering's a curse if nobody else does," she murmured. Clara asked gently why she'd never left Jasper, never gone somewhere new, somewhere people might accept her. Sarah smiled, faint and knowing. "You can't outrun ghosts if they got your blood." She brushed dirt from her palms. "The world don't change, it just learns new words for the same sins." Clara visited her often after that, bringing books and stories from beyond the county line. Tales of women at universities, of machines flying, of laws being written to give freedom new teeth. Sarah listened, eyes narrow, unmoved but curious. "Sounds fine," she would say, "till they realize freedom takes practice." That friendship lasted 2 years. Then the teacher left the South altogether, claiming she was moving to Chicago to fight for women's rights. Sarah didn't try to stop her. She watched her walk away down the road, a small figure swallowed by distance. "Go live, child," she whispered. "Somebody ought to." After Clara's departure, Sarah withdrew again. The visits from travelers stopped completely. Even the children of Jasper grew too old to believe in her. The land dried, the harvests thinned, and by 1915 the once thriving town had begun to decay. Shops closed. Families moved north in search of work. Soon, only silence and decay remained, the same companion Sarah had always known. But time had finally begun to notice her. In small, nearly invisible ways, signs of aging crept in. Her hands trembled after long labor. Her hair, once black, caught flecks of white under sunlight. Her body, faithful for so long, had started to loosen its grip on eternity. And though no one saw it happen, Sarah did, and smiled through the ache. "Took you long enough," she said to the mirror one evening, tracing the faint line near her eyes. The years that followed unfolded quietly but beautifully. The old myths lost hold, the river gained it. People began calling that bend in the water Mills Hollow. When travelers passed through, locals would tell them, "There used to be a woman here who never aged, until one day she finally did." In 1920, a storm swept through Jasper, a storm much like the one years before. When it passed, half the valley was drowned in mud and debris. Volunteers searched farmhouses along the river and found Sarah's cabin half buried beneath branches and silt. Inside, miraculously, almost everything remained intact. The Bible on the table, the carved ledger of names, and a woven shawl still damp from the rain. But of Sarah herself, there was no sign. Some said the flood carried her away. Others believed she walked into the water willingly when she felt her time had come. But those who truly knew her story said something different, that she didn't die at all, that she simply became part of the land she had spent her life defending from forgetting. Years later, when the county built a new bridge across the river, workers unearthed a single item among the roots of an old pecan tree, an iron ring with the initials SM rusted into it. They gave it to the local church, where it still hangs, untouched by polish or ceremony. When sunlight hits the metal, it glows faint gold, like the skin of youth refusing to fade. And down by the riverbank, every spring, the flowers bloom before anywhere else in Jasper. Bright white, the color of dawn on dark water. Some say they grow from seeds caught in the flood. Others say the ground remembers kindness, and the body that never aged gave it back in full. Sarah Mills ceased to be woman, myth, or warning. She became what the South could never bury, the memory of survival without bitterness, endurance without witness, the living proof that history can forget your name but never truly erase your voice. If her story reached you, share it, because remembering Sarah Mills means remembering every name time tried to erase. By the 1930s, the South bore a new name for its old wounds: recession, migration, progress. Cities rose where swamps used to sleep, and factories replaced fields that once bent under endless hands. But Jasper did not rise. It decayed in silence, swallowed by its own forgetting. The church stood hollow, the marketplace empty, and the only sound that broke the quiet was the river, whispering against its banks like breath through an open grave. And yet, even in a dying town, stories endure. Travelers passing through spoke of strange blooms growing near the old bridge, white flowers that opened only at dusk, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The locals said they grew from the blood of the woman who had never aged. But a few elders, the last who had seen her with their own eyes, called the flowers by her name, Sarah's breath. They said it smelled faintly of rain and iron, of life that refused to vanish. In 1932, a journalist from New Orleans heard these rumors and came to write about them. His name was Henry Rowe, a man with the curiosity of science but the heart of a poet. He arrived with dusty shoes and a typewriter, setting up camp near the river to gather local tales. What he found changed the course of his work. Henry interviewed the remaining families of Jasper, now no more than 10 in number. They told him stories half-remembered, softened by time. A woman whose skin stayed the same through 4 generations, a miracle burned twice and reborn again, a voice that haunted the water long after the body was gone. He traced these whispers back to the river bend, where he found the pecan tree still standing, its roots twisted, its bark scarred by lightning. He spent nights by the water, listening. On the third night, as the fog rolled thick across the bank, He could swear he heard singing, low, rhythmic, faint as breathing. Not words, only a hum, steady as the current. He didn't believe in ghosts, but by dawn he wrote a single line in his notebook: "There are truths the living don't deserve to understand." When his article was published, it titled her simply The River Woman. The story spread farther than Sarah Mills herself ever had. Chicago, Boston, even London. Readers drawn to the quiet power of a woman who never grew old yet carried every century within her soul. The tale was debated, embellished, rewritten. Some dismissed it as folklore. Others clung to it as proof of something divine. But underneath all the noise, what lingered in every version was reverence. Sarah, who had been feared in life, became honored in remembrance. In 1941, a small historical society in Jackson proposed marking the site as a local heritage landmark. Yet bureaucracy and budget cuts buried the idea for decades. Still, teachers told her story in whispers to their students. Mothers used her name as lullaby, and men at the bar cursed her resilience when they cursed their own failures. She remained what she had always been, an uninvited mirror. As war raged across oceans, time finally began to age the world faster than men could measure. Buildings fell, new ones rose. Electricity, radios, and roadways transformed the landscape until few remembered the muddy roads of old Jasper. The river kept flowing, indifferent yet eternal. Beneath its slow surface, pieces of broken wood and rusted metal still rested. Bones of the cabin, perhaps, or the remnants of her final hours. But for those who chose to stand by that water's edge, something remained unchanging. When the night grew quiet enough, when the cicadas hushed and the wind stilled, they swore they could see faint outlines in the mist, a young woman's shape, head bowed, watching her reflection as though waiting for it to answer back. And maybe that was the truth of Sarah Mills. Not that she had conquered time or escaped death, but that she had refused to vanish. The world could erase records, burn photographs, and silence witnesses, yet it could not undo the persistence of a soul that lived beyond explanation. Because people only vanish when the land itself decides to forget them. And the land where she lived, heavy with history and guilt, never could. Decades later, historians searching for evidence of her life found one surviving line of Dr. Edmund Calder's lost notebook. The ink had faded, the page torn, but the last sentence was still legible. Her stillness was not the absence of time, but the protest against those who measured it. Those who read it found themselves caught between disbelief and admiration, yet none could escape the feeling that Sarah's silence had spoken louder than history ever intended. Call to action: stay until the end, because the final chapter of Sarah Mills' life is not about how she lived, but how she changed the very idea of what it means to be remembered. Time did what time always does: it forgot. The towns, the churches, the men who once spoke her name now slept underground, their stories carried by dust and rumor. By the 1950s, the land that had once been Jasper County appeared only in census fragments and weather reports. The river still flowed, though its current slowed, thick with memory. And beneath that slow water lived what remained of Sarah Mills. Not her bones, they were never found. Not her cabin, it had long since bloomed into moss and wildflowers. But something deeper, the trace of her being woven into earth and echo. In 1954, a construction crew widening the old dirt road toward what was now Highway 61 stumbled upon a stone slab, half buried near the riverbank. At first they thought it part of an old bridge foundation. But when one worker knelt and brushed away the soil, he saw, carved into the rock, faint letters almost erased by weather: S.M. And below it, one sentence: "The years did not take me. I gave them away." The men argued briefly about whether it was a grave or a prank, but in the end they left it untouched. Their supervisor, uneasy, ordered the path diverted. Some things, he said, were better left to the river. So it remained, half hidden, half holy, a secret marker to a woman the world had chosen to mythologize instead of understand. As decades passed, the country began to change again. Movements rose, demanding dignity and memory for those history had silenced. Somewhere between their chants and the ink of protest signs, Sarah's name began to reappear. Not in textbooks, not in scientific journals, but in poems written by young black women who had never seen Jasper and yet somehow felt its shadow. In 1962, a poet from Alabama published The Woman Who Outran Time, a work dedicated to the unspoken black women of the South. Its opening line read, "She did not stop aging, the world stopped seeing her age." Critics never knew that the poet had read about Sarah Mills in a centuries-old clipping found in a dusty archive. What mattered was how that line struck the heart of a generation. Sarah had lived unseen but had become, without knowing it, the language of resilience for those still fighting the same invisibility she endured. As the nation marched forward, through rights won and riots endured, her story followed quietly behind, ghost and guide at once. And though her image never appeared in photographs again, her essence survived in something less fragile, remembrance spoken aloud. By the time the century turned, the place once called Jasper was nothing but forest reclaiming itself. Only one road led in, cracked with roots and lined by wild white flowers that no one could identify. Travelers who stopped often said the air smelled different there. Cleaner, almost electric, as if every breath carried memory. They would leave stones at the riverbank without knowing why, feeling a quiet pull to pay respect. And every now and then, someone would return at dusk and swear they saw her shadow near the water. A young woman, barefoot, bent slightly forward, watching the current fold over itself like pages turning. They said her reflection didn't stare back, it looked past her, toward the horizon, waiting for whatever lay after forever. But maybe that wasn't spirit at all. Maybe it was just light and hope and the simple truth that lives outlast every body that carries them. History often honors the loud, kings, warriors, men who built monuments. But sometimes, legacy belongs to the quiet, a woman who refused to vanish, even when no one believed she existed as more than myth. The South forgot many things, promises, justice, compassion, but not her. The land that broke her body kept her heartbeat. The river that washed her pain carried her story north, until finally it reached the rest of the world. And in that way, Sarah Mills never really stopped living. She simply changed form, from woman to symbol, from silence to echo. So when wind moves through the pecan trees by that forgotten river and the white petals tremble in its passing, it isn't just weather. It's testimony. It's her voice. Still 19. Still watching. Still waiting for history to understand what she knew all along. That surviving isn't beating time. It's teaching it how to listen. Final call to action. If her name reached you, carry it forward, because remembering Sarah Mills is remembering every voice the centuries tried and failed to silence.